Hello, I'm Nick Crawley. Welcome to this Bible for Life introduction to the letter of Ephesians. If you want to know the background to this letter, and it's important obviously to start with the context, one should read Acts chapter 19, where there's a long description of Paul's ministry in that city over 3 years, from about AD 52 to AD 55. And during that time there was a great revival that took place, almost a new Pentecost that happened, and it affected the entire region of Western Turkey, as we would now call it. And then during that time a whole number of new churches were formed. Now, although some wouldn't agree with me on this, I personally am persuaded that the most satisfactory way of looking at this letter is that it was written by Paul, along with the letters of Colossians and the personal letter to Philemon, from a prison cell in Ephesus. And it was written to Christians all over the region, some of whom he knew and many of whom he didn't know. And he writes, talking about the position of the Christians in Christ, and all that God is doing has done and is doing in Christ. And it is a most lovely letter. It's a letter written to you and to me by Paul. It's a general letter, and it sums up the overarching purpose, as it were, the meta-narrative, of where we fit into the purposes of God in history. And it's absolutely fantastic description, and this may well be your favourite book, and this is probably the reason why it is. So the overriding purpose is for the letter is that Paul describes the place of Christ and how Christ is now uniting all things together around him. He's the head, although that word is slightly difficult to translate in Ephesians 1 verses 9 and 10. It's more that everything is orientated around Christ, and he sums up everything in himself. That is the overriding purpose of God, and it's Christ's exaltation as Lord of not just the church but of absolutely everything is prominent, is preeminent in this letter. He is exalted primarily above the spiritual powers. Now, if we go back to Acts chapter 19 again, we see that there's a great deal of activity, of spiritual activity, in that region, both in terms of Paul's own extraordinary healing ministry, but also in terms of the demonic, and in terms of people being set free from the power of evil. And again, if you look at Ephesians, you find that these themes are running very deeply and very strongly through the letter. The unification of both Jews and believing non-Jews in Christ, in one body, is a sign to the powers of their defeat. And not only that, but of their imminent destruction and their end, when all things are summed up in Christ, which will have happened at the end of the age. And therefore the church is described in very, very rich terms in this letter. They're God's people, God's household. It's a building, it's a temple, it's a place where God himself is worshipped. It's a place where the Spirit of God dwells. It's a place as such where the activity, the gifts of the Spirit are exercised, and the body grows as it speaks the truth lovingly but clearly, and as every part does its part, is fully active. And so you get this immensely rich description of what it means to be in Christ as the church and as his body. And then this culminates in this just extraordinary description at the end of chapter 5 of where Paul takes the very principle of marriage, that a man leaves his father and his mother and is joined and united to his wife, and they become one flesh, and applies that not to human beings beings, but to Christ, but to God in Christ and the church. And so there is this marriage of the divine and the human. There is this, and Paul says this is absolute mystery, but I'm describing Christ and the church, and that is an extraordinary statement that we're the bride of Christ. We're united in this way with him, and this is the whole direction that everything is moving in. Or as he says in 1 Corinthians, that we should live in undivided devotion to Christ. And so there is this very, very elaborate and description of how we should live, which parallels Jesus' own teaching in Matthew 5 on the Sermon on the Mount, the 6 things that Jesus draws out in the second part of that chapter, and what Paul describes in chapters 4 and 5. There's a very close similarity all the way through. So this is the lifestyle of the Christian and the Christian church, and it's very rich, and you'll enjoy it.